Greetings and salutations, and thank you for clicking on this video. We're going to talk about increasing performance in virtual machines running in VirtualBox. Things that you can do to make them go faster. This video assumes that you already know how to use VirtualBox, that you know how to install a virtual machine in it, and that you understand a little bit about how the system works. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is the settings that you would use when you actually install the virtual machine. So let's look at the settings here for Linux Mint 17.3. And the first setting that we want to talk about is processor and memory. Let's see, right now I have a gigabyte of memory allocated to this virtual machine. For most Linux, you can get away with allocating just 2 gigs as long as you're not going to be doing anything with it and heavy running a lot of big programs inside the virtual machine. And so if you're just testing and playing around, this would actually be just fine, 1 gig or 2 gigs or something like that. If your host has more memory to offer, then of course more memory is going to help the machine go faster. So if I was running one virtual machine right now on this system and I want it to go really fast, like I was using a lot of software within the machine, then I would give it like 4 gigs, which would be like half of the system memory, and it'd be just fine. That depends on how much memory you have. If you have 4 gigs, you're not going to be able to give it more than 2 without it complaining. The next thing to look at is the processor, and how many processor cores are you going to give it. Now this depends on your system and how many processor cores you have. In my case, I have a 3-core processor, it's an AMD, and it has 6 threads. So VirtualBox is seeing those threads and it's offering them. The most that I would probably do here would be 3 cores, which would mean that each core in the processor would have 1 thread devoted to the virtual machine, and that would make things go pretty fast. But you want to allocate at least 2 if you can, because a lot of software for Linux these days is written to run on a multi-core system. It's multi-threaded, and if you run that software on a single core, then it'll run, but it'll just be really slow because it's opening up a lot of processes at once. So make sure that you give your Linux systems 2 cores, and if you have like an i7 with 8 cores in it, and then you can give it a whole bunch. You could give it 4 if you wanted to. It depends on how much performance you wanted from that. Let's talk about display. Make sure that you crank this display memory all the way up to 128. Sorry, that's the limit that VirtualBox gives you. You can't make it any more than that. And then you want to enable 3D acceleration if you are going to be using a desktop that needs it. In other words, this is going to emulate a video card for the virtual machine. The biggest bottleneck is storage, because what VirtualBox does is it creates a great big file that represents your hard drive for your VM. And those are called VDI files, VirtualBox disk images. And some systems, depending on the file system and what you've got going on the host, don't like to work with large files. Everything tends to slow down, especially if you're using ext4. So there are some ways around that, which I'm going to show you a little bit later on in the video, but right now I want to concentrate on these settings. So for the SATA controller here, this is where your virtual hard drives are going to be mounted. You want to make sure that you have this used host I/O cache enabled. This means it's going to be able to pass through to the host and take advantage of the host's I/O cache on the drive. If this is not checked, things will run slower. So that's one thing that you want to make sure that you do in storage. Another thing to increase performance is make sure that before you install the machine, that you have this set to a bridged adapter, if you can do that. And you should be able to do that if your system is on some sort of router. So if you have a router that is going to be using DHCP to assign IP addresses to devices that are on your local network, if you set this to bridged, what will happen is the virtual machine will go out to DHCP and it will get its own IP address just like it's a real physical device on the network. This is a lot faster than using the standard, which is NAT the network translation protocol, because in that case what it's doing is it's using the IP address of the host machine, and then it is translating all of that data for the virtual machine in an extra layer. So if you can get away with not using NAT, this actually goes a lot faster in VirtualBox. And the same goes for VMware as well. So a lot of these tips and tricks apply to VMware too. Okay, so let's see. There's not much else to show here. I will show you that when I set up virtual machines, I get rid of all the little eye candy, like the little drop-down menus in full screen mode. I'll get rid of the bar at the bottom as well, because it's just wasting space and I don't use it. So that's virtual machine settings when you set them up. Another thing that you're going to want to do is to enable the write cache on the virtual drive inside the virtual machine. And let's go ahead and open this up. Now when I'm opening up this virtual machine, I want you guys to take note of how long it takes to boot, because later in the video I'm going to show you some stuff that'll make it go a lot faster. Right now I have a pretty typical setup, so that's not too bad for boot time. Not horrible at all. So we'll open up the machine, wait for the desktop to load. There we go. And here's our desktop. Now what I want to show you, once you get the machine installed, assuming that you have a graphical environment on the machine, you want to open up a program called Disks, and then you want to go to Drive Settings. Now that menu might be up here, it could be all over the place depending on what version of Disks you have. Just look for the little hamburger menu or the little gear. Make sure that write cache is on, and also make sure that's true for your host as well. That will make the system go a lot faster. It will warn you that there is the potential for data loss with that if you suddenly lose power on a virtual machine, and it's because if something is sitting in memory that hasn't been written yet, then it will definitely go poof if the machine suddenly loses power. My experience is I've never had a real huge issue with that. I haven't run across any file corruption. That's going to make the system go faster because in a sense you're doing a double buffer here, where you have buffering within the virtual machine, and of course the host is going to be buffering as well if you have it turned on there. If you install Windows inside a virtual machine, you don't need to mess with that because Windows has that enabled by default, whereas Linux, being super safe, wants to turn that off. So let's go ahead and shut that machine down, and we can move on to some other tweaks that you can do to make things go faster. So the first thing that you can do is to take all of your virtual machines and put them somewhere else other than the same hard drive that the host uses. So most folks have one big happy hard drive in their system, and they may have the home directory on a different partition, but they're still using the same drive. So you have one drive for the host, and like if we look at my system right now, you'll see, so let me just do ls block here. Alright, so you'll see that I have one big happy hard drive right there, and I don't even have a swap partition. I've got a swap file, and this is a great big old Western Digital Caviar Black we're looking at. And then down here I've got another drive which is going to be just for VMs. And that's what I'm getting at here, is that you can create another drive, format another drive, and then stick it in your computer and just put virtual machines on it. And that will make it go a lot faster, because when the virtual machine is running, there's a lot of input-output, and it's sharing it with the host. If the host issues a bunch of input and output, then you see they're going to have to balance that out. The host operating system is going to have to balance that out. Whereas if the VMs live on their own drive and they have direct access to them, then you don't have a problem. Also, another step that you can take is to create a partition somewhere for your virtual machine to use as its drive. And that's a bit more complex, and also makes it a whole lot less flexible, because most people use virtual machines just to test and play. We're not setting them up to run all the time. So let's take a look at the situation we got going here. Ordinarily, what the VirtualBox program does is it will create a folder within your home folder or directory, however you want to say it, and that folder will be called VirtualBox VMs, and that's where all the VMs go. Now I've modified that a little bit because I've been moving stuff around and playing, and one of the things is I don't want the virtual machines to be in the home directory. I don't want it there. So what I have done is I have actually moved it to its own directory in root, and that directory is called VM, and since I have one big happy hard drive, it makes no difference. If I was going to split the home directory off, then I would just make sure that I had a really large root partition that would hold the VMs, I guess, if I wanted to keep this the way it was. So if we go into VM, just do a list here, and what we're going to do is just ls and show you that's where all these VMs are living. Now, the drive that I am using for the VMs is an SSD, and I have actually put XFS on that drive, which is a different file system from ext4. XFS is something that you'll find on big servers that have a lot of files and a lot of large files. It's got some advantages. XFS is multi-threaded, which means that if it's reading more than one section of data off a disk at once, it can actually do that in separate threads, and it can make it go faster. Also, it is really good with very, very large files, big database files and things like that. For most desktop applications, it's overkill, and XFS does have its disadvantages. XFS doesn't like hard crashes. XFS is not automatically checked at boot time like the ext4 file system that you'd normally find on your host, and so therefore you may have errors in there that you don't know about. You might have data corruption, and it requires separate tools. But it's fast, and that's the whole point. So we have XFS on the SSD, and we can take a real quick look here at that SSD and just show you that it's the same stuff. Alright, and I actually want to create a file here, and I'm just going to call this SSD, and you'll see why in just a second. This is just a little flag file that we've created on that drive. Now what I'm going to do is, let's see, I need to unmount this drive, and let's see, that is SDB1. There we go. Make sure I got all that correct. Yep. We're going to unmount the drive, and then I'm going to mount it somewhere else. So we're going to sudo mount, and we're going to put it in, let's see, we want dev SDB1, and we're going to put it in VM. Now what this is going to do is it's going to mount that drive in that virtual machine folder, and then all of the virtual machines in there are going to be from the drive and not on the local system. Okay, so if we go to VM and take a look, oh, actually I don't need the slash. Now you see that we have all the same stuff because I just copied it all over, and then I've got my little flag file that says SSD, and that lets me know that, yeah, this is doing what it's supposed to do. So now let's go ahead and restart this, and remember how long it took Linux Mint to boot earlier in the video, okay? We're going to boot the same system off of a separate drive with a really fast file system on it. So let's see what it does. Now it's actually taking longer. Yep, I don't want to close that. Well, the boot time is about the same. And shut that down. Let's make sure that this is seeing the right stuff, gang. Yep, it's seeing the right machines. So it didn't appear to have that much of an impact. Fumble fingers, man, making all kinds of weird stuff on the screen. Let's try that one more time. Maybe it just needed to get cached. About the same as we saw before in performance. So whether you want to do this or not is going to depend on how you use your virtual machines, whether it's going to make that big of a difference. This is one of the things that I was playing around with. I've tried it a bunch of different ways, and I've noticed that it really doesn't make all that much difference. So let's try this experiment. Let's open two at a time. Now remember, we're on the SSD right now. So we're going to open Linux Lite and Linux Mint. Let's see how long it takes for both of these to get to the login screen. Oop, not new. Start, thank you. Okay, so both of them are opening here. Separate drive, not on the host drive. That's not too bad. Let's go ahead and shut this down. Now, of course, the big advantage to having it on a separate drive is that if the host drive needs to do something, it doesn't take away from the virtual machine or vice versa. But this is kind of what I came across. It's not the biggest speed increase in the world. So let us do this. I'll go back up here and find my command. Yeah, just unmount that particular one. Okay, so now we've unmounted that drive and we're on the host drive. So we're back to where we were. We can see that by just doing see, now we have no SSD flag. Let's see if that improves when we boot up two machines at the same time. Just to make sure, we'll reopen that. Okay, let's wait and see how long this takes. Now, if you look over to the right of the screen, you'll see what's going on. So now we're seeing a slowdown. This is definitely taking longer than when it was on its own individual hard drive. So if you want to open a bunch of machines at the same time, you might want to consider putting everything on a separate hard drive. Now for me, I really don't want the overhead of having to deal with a separate hard drive right now on this system. So what I am doing is just using the VM folder that's in the OneDrive that's got the entire system on it. You see, Linux Mint hasn't even booted yet. Huge difference in performance, and that is the combination of having it on ext4, which is the file system that the host is running, and having it be on the same drive as the host. Whereas on the SSD we had XFS for the file system, and of course it's devoted completely to the virtual machines. I'm wondering if this didn't crash. It's taking quite some time to get booted up. Let's just wait and see what it does here. Yeah. I think this one crashed, ladies and gentlemen. 'cause I can't get control of it in any way at all. Okay, so that's pretty much the video. I've shown you everything that I wanted you to see. So if you don't want to continue watching, that's perfectly all right. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and do that again. I want to see what the difference is in speed. Although you could see it was taking forever for Linux Lite to load. So let's do that one more time, and hopefully they won't crash. So this is just an extra benefit for those of you who care about such things. Well, Linux Mint is complaining. So yeah, it definitely crashed at boot time. Another thing that you can do to improve performance is to make sure that you have the right tools enabled. The correct version of the VirtualBox guest editions, and 9 times out of 10 the ones that are coming from the distribution will be old, so you might want to go ahead and install them from the disk here. Just insert that, and then a CD-ROM appears in your virtual machine, and you can install those from there. So anyway, gang, you can take away your own conclusions on that, and I hope this helps you out a little bit. Wasn't exactly the result that I thought I would see doing that experiment. It's actually not that much of a difference in speed, is it? So I'll just leave my system simple and use one big happy partition for everything for now. And thank you for watching the video. Make sure to check out Easy Linux on the web, check out Easy Linux on Facebook, and check out freedompenguin.com for lots of cool stories about Linux. We'll do it again soon.